aquí también. Okay. Muy buenos días. Vamos a dar inicio a esta primera sesión del Seminario Universitario de Culturas de Medio Oriente y voy a pedirle al doctor Alberto Vital, coordinador de Humanidades, que nos dirija unas palabras. ¿Primero Manuel? Bueno, primero hablará el doctor Manuel Perló, el director del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Ya saben que en el protocolo todos tenemos que decir algo. Yo voy a ser muy breve, simplemente decirles que en el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales estamos muy complacidos por el inicio de las actividades del Seminario de Culturas del Medio Oriente, que recientemente aprobó su creación nuestro rector y designó al doctor Carlos Martínez Assad, coordinador de este seminario. Se trata de un tema sin duda muy importante, fundamental, y para la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y para el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales en particular, pues es un honor ser la sede de este programa, de este seminario universitario. Y pues quiero aprovechar para felicitar al doctor Martínez Assad por este nombramiento, y qué mejor que tener una gran conferencia como la que se va a llevar a cabo el día de hoy para arrancar las actividades de este seminario, que ya tiene todo un programa de actividades para este año y para el otro. Sin duda van ustedes a recibir noticias de este seminario porque va a tener una cantidad muy importante de eventos, de conferencias, mesas redondas y otras actividades que nos van a permitir un acercamiento muy profundo, muy completo al tema de las culturas del Medio Oriente. Así que les damos la bienvenida y yo le daría la palabra al coordinador de Humanidades, al doctor Domingo Alberto Vital, para que nos dirija unas palabras y nos presente a nuestro conferencista, a quien también le damos la bienvenida. Welcome, Uzi, to Mexico, to the National Autonomous University of Mexico.
Muy buenos días tengan ustedes para esta Coordinación de Humanidades, para este auditorio. Jorge Carpizo de la Coordinación. Es un motivo de celebración, hay una sensación de efervescencia, incluso yo diría festividad en nuestras instalaciones por la presencia de todas y todos ustedes, especialmente de nuestro distinguido conferencista inaugural que nos acompaña el día de hoy. Es también, como ya lo dijo el doctor Manuel Perló, la conferencia inaugural de uno de los seminarios universitarios que, por acuerdo del señor rector Enrique Graue Vigers, se ha abierto, ha instalado sus trabajos en este año, hace muy pocos días formalmente, de manera, digamos, en trabajos previos ya tiene un largo desarrollo y muchísimo le debe y le debemos, y le debo yo también, al doctor Carlos Martínez Assad por el esfuerzo que hace posible que hoy estemos convocados y reunidos para abrir las puertas formalmente, repito, del Seminario Universitario de Culturas del Medio Oriente. Quisiera dar la bienvenida al doctor Mario Ruz, director del Instituto de Investigaciones Filológicas, al cual yo también pertenezco, a la doctora Alicia Girón, directora de un seminario que nace con una vocación, o que existe y que tendrá una vocación de vínculos muy fuertes con el seminario que hoy formalmente nace. Ella coordina los trabajos desde hace 2 años, ya poco más de 2 años, desde febrero de 2014, del Seminario Universitario de Estudios Asiáticos, que tiene todo el proyecto de convertirse en Seminario Universitario de Estudios Asiáticos y Africanos. Asia es pequeña para la doctora Alicia Girón, entonces le hemos unido el otro continente, África. En realidad, la universidad con estos dos seminarios está tendiendo puentes de comprensión y de trabajo transversal con espacios geopolíticos. Tenemos un mapa ante la vista que son absolutamente estratégicos, geoestratégicos para el mundo contemporáneo. No adelanto nada de lo que se nos va a decir a partir de unos minutos, pero indudablemente Asia, África, Medio Oriente, con todo lo que significa de vinculación, digamos, con los dos continentes, sus pertenencias múltiples, geográficas, pero también geopolíticas, el Medio Oriente juega entonces un papel muy importante. La extraordinaria complejidad de cada una de sus regiones históricas, esto que el conferencista llamará identidades preestatales, se unen a la formación de estados, lo que sabemos de los siglos anteriores, especialmente el siglo XX, para conformar un Medio Oriente de una extrema complejidad. Yo desde mi infancia, desde que empecé a leer periódicos, el Medio Oriente ha estado presente de una manera o de otra, siempre con un relieve geopolítico de altísimo nivel y de indudable importancia. Saludo también a la embajada, a las personas que nos acompañan de la embajada. Siéntanse bienvenidas, bienvenidos en esta coordinación de Humanidades y asimismo a los jóvenes, a la gente joven. Por supuesto que es un seminario abierto a los trabajos a la atención de todas y de todos, de todas las generaciones. Hago énfasis en la gente joven, algunas exalumnas, Carla, bienvenida, en fin, bienvenidos también el doctor Hernán Taboada, Sara Sefcovic, siéntanse bienvenidas y quienes tienen la oportunidad o han tenido o tendrán la oportunidad de conversar con Carlos Martínez Assad, saben o sabrán que su sapiencia, su conocimiento del Medio Oriente y su conciencia de que la cultura es un hilo conductor importantísimo, sin el cual no se entienden muchos de los fenómenos que están ocurriendo, pues saben también que tienen un privilegio y una delicia de escuchar con la fineza, y la amplitud de conocimientos que Carlos Martínez Assad tiene con respecto a nuestra área de estudios, nuestra área en términos geopolíticos, pero también con ese hilo conductor, repito, con ese instrumento, también lo podemos llamar así, que denominamos cultura o culturas, en plural, importante. Carlos, felicidades, no lo pude hacer en ocasión anterior, pero ahora lo digo, felicidades por el haber sido designado director del Seminario Universitario de las Culturas del Medio Oriente. Y sin más, después de estas palabras, puedo dar la bienvenida al profesor doctor Rabi de la Universidad de Tel Aviv. Leo una breve semblanza y damos paso también a su conferencia. Director del Centro Moshe Daya para Estudios del Medio Oriente y África e investigador principal del Centro de Estudios Iraníes de la Universidad de Tel Aviv. Anteriormente fue jefe del Departamento de Oriente Medio y de Historia de África en la misma universidad. Durante 2004-2005 fue profesor visitante en el Instituto Lipinski de la Universidad de San Diego. Profesor Rabi también dirige el taller de Tau, un seminario de 10 días al año sobre estudios internacionales que se centran en la situación geopolítica de Israel y sus vecinos. Su investigación se centra en la historia moderna y la evolución de los estados y las sociedades en Medio Oriente, Irán y las relaciones árabes, el petróleo y la política en el Medio Oriente y las dinámicas entre sunitas y chiitas. Dentro de este marco ha supervisado las tesis de numerosos candidatos al doctorado en dichos campos en los últimos años. Ha escrito una serie de libros en inglés y hebreo. En 2015 publicó Yemen, Revolución, Guerra Civil y la Unificación en Tauro. que cubre la historia moderna de Yemen. Publicó también libros relacionados en hebreo, Yemen, la anatomía de un estado fallido, en 2014, y publicó en 2007 Arabia Saudí, un unido petróleo en el laberinto de la religión y política. Y tiene una larga serie de publicaciones que indudablemente lo acreditan como una personalidad en estos campos de estudio. Bienvenidos a usted y le damos la palabra.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, ya ha dicho mucho el doctor Vital, el coordinador. Yo solamente quiero agregar unas cuantas palabras. La temática que abordará Uzi Rabi está muy orientada a conocer la diversidad que caracteriza Medio Oriente y algo que es significativo en lo que él hace es los nuevos enfoques que emplea para la explicación de lo que allí sucede. Con su presencia esta mañana en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, comienza con buenos augurios el seminario que nos hemos propuesto crear. Un espacio para mantener el intercambio y diálogo con los académicos y artistas que sigan con sus estudios o con sus creaciones el acontecer de esa parte del mundo de la que se habla mucho y hay que decirlo, se sabe poco. El SUCUMU será un espacio para la reflexión entre especialistas y lugar para la formación de estudiantes que se acercan a la temática desde una perspectiva libre de prejuicios en la búsqueda de un conocimiento objetivo, acercándose a países de donde han surgido grandes civilizaciones y que actualmente influyen en el mundo por muy diferentes razones. Estamos aquí para escucharlo sobre una problemática en la que hace coincidir a Siria, Líbano, Irak y Yemen con un título sin duda provocador, quiero decir teóricamente. Y sin más, quiero darle la palabra al profesor Rabi, agradeciendo de antemano que está aquí también gracias al apoyo de la Sociedad de Amigos de la Universidad de Tel Aviv, a quien agradecemos el gesto, y desde luego a las autoridades universitarias, alguien que no está presente con nosotros, el doctor Kenoyama, el secretario de Desarrollo Institucional, a quien se debe toda la formalidad de este seminario. Agradezco mucho también la presencia de algunos de los amigos, directores, miembros de la comunidad universitaria que no fueron mencionados. Está Guadalupe Ferrer, la directora de actividades cinematográficas, Gina Bechelami, de comunicación de TV UNAM, y bueno, Malena Mijares, también de la Coordinación, de comunicación de la Coordinación, y sin duda algunos otros que quizá no he podido mencionar, pero también quiero recalcar la presencia de nuestro amigo Jorge de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, quien está a cargo precisamente de lo que concierne a África y Medio Oriente. Así es que desde luego estamos muy contentos con su presencia y desde luego con la presencia de tantos amigos e investigadores que se están muy interesados en la temática. Y sin más, pues quiero pedirle a Uzi Rabi que comience por favor su disertación. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Let me start with kind of a big thank you for Dr. Martínez Assad, for this dear gentleman that actually provided me with the really generous hospitality. Thanks for the generous introduction. And what I'm going actually to deal with, is it okay that I'm sit, or would you like me actually standing? How is that? Can you hear me? Is that okay? Okay, so I'll use the computer when it is needed, and I'll rather stand. What we can say about this opening session of the seminar, and I am really privileged to be the speaker in this opening session. While dealing with the Middle East, you know, there is a lot to say. A lot to say. So one should ask himself, what could be the most striking, outstanding element with which to show how dramatic the situation is and how the Middle East has become something totally different from what we had in the 20th century. For the sake of this session, we decided to talk or to focus on what we call the phenomenon of failed states in the Middle East. And of course, while dealing with that, let's start with kind of a broad generalization or definition of what we do mean by saying failed state. This has become something by which to depict or characterize states where the regime cannot exert full influence or control over the whole territory. There are many models and paradigms that are related to the notion or phenomenon of failed states. Failing states, collapsing states, etc. Since I am not a political scientist, I'm not going to delve into too many details about these definitions. But what we have to bear in mind is that in this presentation, I would focus on some states in the Middle East that from the beginning were artificial, that throughout the 20th century were ruled by iron-fisted dictators, and paradoxically speaking, atop the Arab Spring, 6 years ago, or less, with the toppling down of many dictators, what we got in these states is sort of a chaotic situation that had huge ramification, implications on the region and beyond. So you know which state I'm not going to speak about. I'm not going to talk about Egypt. Why? Egypt is kind of a territory that from times immemorial, thousands of years, has been there as an ancient civilization. And the sea here and there became sort of a boundary that differentiated Egypt from the rest of the Middle East. I'm not going to talk about Iran, another ancient civilization which used to be empire millennia ago, and has, throughout the ages, has acquired kind of a very distinctive identity of what we call state by all means and standards. What I'm going to focus on is, relatively speaking, newly created states. States that created only 100 years ago, maybe 95 years ago, in the aftermath of the First World War. States like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, one would say Jordan, but we are going to focus mainly on them, maybe in Libya too, and Yemen too, because these states from the beginning have shown something which is very problematic. They were artificial because they were built up in tandem with the imperial interest or the colonial interest by which to create states not necessarily while listening to the voices of history, but to create a state in order to bolster the Western presence in the Middle East. And let's take, for example, two cases that are right to the point. Let's start with Iraq. I'm just trying actually to make it broad and general as I can. We don't have too much time to delve into the dispute between Sunnah and Shia, Arabs and Kurds, Arabs and Persians, Turks and Kurds. But let's just say one thing that is very, very imperative to remember. The map that I showed you in the beginning is, relatively speaking, a new geopolitical map. This whole region was to be ruled by an empire that lasted for 600 years. It is the Ottoman Empire that ruled the whole area. Let's just have a look once again. All these states that I mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine/Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, we're not here. What we got here is kind of an empire, Sunni, which is the mainstream of Islam, and the only exception to the rule was Iran. Iran was sort of a monarchy by itself. Shi'i, not Sunni. What happened after the demise of the Ottoman Empire is the penetration of Britain and France and the creation of nation states, something which is very Western in nature. Nation state. So let me take just two examples by which to further corroborate the argument. While looking at Iraq, that was created in 1921 by the British, one could see from the beginning that Iraq was to become an amalgam that was to include both Shiites and Sunnis, both Kurds and Arabs. Kurds, by the way, should be regarded as a distinct people. They have their own language, their own history, their own narrative, etc. The same goes for Turks, Persians, Arabs, different peoples. But what we got here is kind of a newly created state named Iraq. The king that was nominated by the British was brought from the Arabian Peninsula. And this was the beginning of the monarchy of Iraq. I was very, very eager when I was in the British archives while having my PhD to find kind of a reasoning and sort of a logic of the British while creating Iraq. Well, one could say, if you take into account that the British ruled India here, it would be very important to have Basra at the head of the Persian Gulf all the way down to India. If you look at Baghdad and the tap line which was to go to the other side of the region, you understand that what they had in mind is imperial interest. Very, very typical to colonial powers. But what I was very amazed by is kind of a correspondence between London and Baghdad in February 1921, when the then actually political agent, British, which was sitting in Baghdad, Sir Arnold Wilson, was to get kind of a telegram from London Foreign Office. And this telegram actually elaborated on the possibility of what if. What if the Kurds will go for the Arabs and vice versa? Or Sunnis per Shia and vice versa? And I was really very eager to find the response that was to get back from Baghdad, and I found it 5 days later on. And it was Arnold Wilson who said, "Thank you for the note." He thanked London for the warning sign. And he said, and I quote, "It won't happen here. We shall teach them to let bygone be bygone." What does that mean, to let bygone be bygone? What the British had in mind is a totally different agenda. Since all of these people are going to become Iraqis, there is no use whatsoever to speak about Sunnah and Shia, Arabs and Kurds, and etc. So the notion was pretty clear. The neoliberalist West was to create a totally different Middle East built up on nation states where people are going to leave behind their primordial identity, Sunnah, Shia, Druze, Alawite, etc., and become equal citizens of the state. Well, the West was the victorious. The notion of a nation state was developing in Europe and became very successful, at least partially successful. So what happened here is that every colonial power was trying to compile a newly created creature, which in the end of the day was supposed to become a nation state, where people are no more what they were before the state. So we are not going to talk about pre-state identities because all of them would become Iraqis. The same, and I'll make long story short, can be said about Syria. Look at the map. Very, very important. Kurds in Syria. Alawites, which are sort of a step brother or stepson of the Shia. Druze, Christians, and mostly Sunnis. That was the program of the French in Syria and Lebanon. Lebanon was cut off from Syria, was tailored up, demographically speaking, in kind of a very sectarian nature. Maronites, Sunni Muslims, Druze. Each one of them was to get a portfolio, and Lebanon was to become a state by its own. The new Syria was not to forget that Lebanon was cut off from Syria, and this was the dream of what we call in Arabic Syria al-Kubra. Syria al-Kubra, which means a greater Syria, which has an irredenta claim on Lebanon. Now it would sound very strange because there is no Syria anymore. But this was the case in the 20th century. 20th century, Lebanon cut off. Here we got actually Druze. This is Jebel Duruz, historically speaking, the Druze Mount. This is Jebel Alawiya, the Alawites Mount, historically speaking. This is Hasake and Rojava in Kurdish, which means that this is the Kurdish part of Syria. Sunnis are the majority. And of course, here too, the notion was pretty clear. With the passage of time, the Syrian Republic would make them all, sooner or later, citizens of the Republic. Syrians, leaving behind, again, primordial identities. Now, again, really, and to make a long story short, what I'm trying actually to argue is that these primordial identities proved to be much more resilient than the modern ones. And paradoxically speaking, after the demise of Saddam Hussein in 2003 in Iraq, Iraq was dismembered, disintegrated to its pre-state components, and the same actually was to happen in Syria with the weakening of, or in the background of the weakening of Bashar al-Assad. So take these two states. This is actually the foci in our Middle East. This is the problem. ISIS, Islamic State, Daesh, is the symptom of the problem. ISIS was to be given birth on the ruins of one time Syria, one time Iraq. Now, why it is so important for us if we would like actually to better understand the Middle East? If I'm going to speak or to talk about the Middle East in terms of Syria and Iraq, it is as if I would use the map of the 20th century. Because people do not identify themselves in line with their nationalism, but in line with their ethnic or religious origin. Sectarianism is the main thing by which to define those areas. So let me take you to what happened after the Arab Spring. And this is what we got actually in recent years and nowadays. Let's say that, just for the sake of the argument, that we merge Syria and Iraq together. How can we read this map? What do we have here? Something which is very, very distinct and clear is this green part. This is Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, this is a state or a nation. By any standard, what it is missing is just the recognition and the name. Because if you will go to Erbil or even Suleymaniya, you would listen to people speaking Kurdish. The army is called Peshmerga, those who are willing to die, if I would translate it literally. The flag is Kurdish, the national anthem is Kurdish. For the world, this is still part of Iraq. Because the world cannot provide alternative definitions. And I don't want to confuse you, but you can actually imagine what I'm talking about. If we're going to have a Kurdish independent state here, this would raise kind of a furious reaction from Iran and from Turkey. By the way, this morning, Erdogan sent his artillery into one-time Syria. He says that he's going for ISIS. We know that what he has in mind is slaughtering Kurds in order to make sure that Kurds are not getting the upper hand here. But this is sort of a Kurdistan, what we have here. If you would like me to delve into some more details about that, this is Rojava, which is the western part of one-time Kurdistan in the eyes of the Kurds. Just imagine that the circle was Kurdistan once, not a state, but a huge province, a mountainous province. It was to be divided by the British and the French concoction into Iranian Kurds, Iraqi Kurds, Syrian Kurds, Turkish Kurds. But the Kurds are mostly Kurds. And what we have now is kind of an irredenta or a claim by which to revive the notion of one-time Kurdistan. And the Kurdish lexicon or vocabulary would identify Rojava, Rojhalat, and some other north, west, south, and east portions of one-time Kurdistan that might be united, might not. But the Kurds are thinking of themselves by themselves. So if somebody thinks of the integration of Iraq, for example, like we do hear time and again from Barack Obama and others, he should find a new definition for Iraq rather than Iraq as an Arab state. Because if newly Iraq is going to be defined as an Arab state, I am, as a Kurdish guy, won't be on board because the definition of the state as an Arab make me a second-class citizen because I'm not an Arab, I'm a Kurd. That's just an example. What is that? Baghdad to Basra. This is, according to me, the UN won't accept this definition. I name it Shi'istan. What does that mean, Shi'istan? The Americans, after toppling Saddam Hussein in 2003, and Saddam Hussein was Sunni, they nominated a Shi'i government, supported it because Shiites actually constitute 60% of the Iraqi population. And what happened here is that from Baghdad to Basra, you have an Iraqi government ruled by Shi'is, Shi'i militias, and being supported by Iran, which is, as we said, a Shi'i patron in this region. So Iran, after the toppling down of Saddam Hussein, got sort of an access into Iraq, and the one who knows history of the Iraqi-Iranian chapter, this is the old dream the Iranians actually had in mind for ages. To get into Iraq, this is something what was given by the new circumstances in the post-2003 situation in Iraq. Shi'istan, Kurdistan, Kurdistan, mini Kurdistan, Jabal Alawiya, let's get back to that. This is for me what I call Alawistan. What does that mean, Alawistan? This is the land of the Alawites, Bashar al-Assad and his sect, supported by some militias, and mainly supported by Iran, Hezbollah, and the Russians. The Russians have vested interest here in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. So they came and actually gleaned some bargaining chips in order to use them if somebody is going to give them hard time when it comes to Ukraine, Georgia, etc. But Russia is another problem. We are not going to deal with that. We are going to focus on failed states here. Here are the Druze. So what is this gray zone? On both Syria and Iraq. This is basically what I call Sunnistan, the land of the Sunnis. If somebody is going to ask himself, how come that ISIS got full control over this gray spot, which is greater than the British island, controlling 10 million people, identities, since all of them are Sunnis, they'd rather have a Sunni definition and Sunni leader rather than a Shiite from here or an Alawite from there. Why do I say that? On the one hand, it could be very, very confused and make people very tired, actually, to hear what I'm saying, because it's a lot of names, and if somebody is not familiar with the history of this region, he would get lost. So this is not only what I want to say. If you are an expert on that, you have to know who is who, definitely. This is a totally different geopolitical situation. Geopolitical map. So first of all, our advice to policymakers, to diplomats, students, public at large, etc., is not to use the notions of the 20th century, because it would lead you to sort of a deadlock. Make sure that you have in mind this map, which is built up. It is not formal though, but if you're going to go through Halab, Aleppo, or Mosul, or whatever, if you're going to find somebody, the Western mind would lead you to kind of a question of who you are. And you would expect to have a response which is based on nationalistic considerations. I am Lebanese, I am Syrian, I am Iraqi. Well, here is the news. This is irrelevant. Because what's relevant is whether he or she is Sunni or Shi'i, Druze, Kurd, Alawite, etc. Otherwise, I won't have any possibility to build up a map of power configuration. So first, what is most striking here is there is a change that before you give me the solutions to the problems, show me that you know what the problems are. I keep saying that in the United States, in Europe, I keep listening to people, even in my home country, who has many solutions to the problems. The problem is they don't know what the problem is. They have a solution, but it has nothing to do with the problem. So what happened? People stick to the notions of the 20th century, think the same way they thought there, without noticing that we have crossed the line and we need different definitions, geopolitically speaking and socio-demographically speaking. So what you have to make sure you know, what is the differentiation between Druze, Kurds, Turks, and others? Alawites, Sunni, Shia, etc. And here comes the most important thing as regard to our research agenda. If we are to be equipped with such new definitions, what we have to make sure that we understand that the rhythm in this part of the world is totally different from what we have in other parts of the world. It is as if I would say, and just metaphorically put, that the past is attacking the present in order to build up a new future. So we have here kind of a dance that forces us to control the past and to make sure that we are not taking the panoramic view as kind of a given fact, because what counts in the Middle East is not what's going on the ground, it's what people have in mind. So as a researcher, what I have to do is to get sort of a channel through which to get to the mindset of the other. I can't sit in Washington, D.C. and create a solution to the Kurds, to the Alawites, if I keep thinking by Western standards. I just can't. Would you like that somebody would tell you what Mexico should do if he hasn't got a clue about what Mexicanism is? Without knowing the multi-layered history of Mexico? Without understanding actually the nature or the DNA of this state or this culture? You wouldn't like that. So why, for God's sake, everybody knows better than anybody else what should be done with the Middle East? Why? We have to beware and must be very keenly aware of this picture. Because what we are dealing with is not the present, is the narratives of the past portrayed by different groups of the nowadays society. Again, metaphorically put, it is as if every group is diving into or digging into the multi-layered history. And one simple note, remember, the Middle East is the cradle of civilization. That should not be forgotten. With all respect, we are not the United States. 250 years of independence. We have Babylon, Persia, Egypt, Jerusalem. This is where everything was to start with the human civilization. Now, the burden people have in the Middle East, the heavy burden, is the burden of multi-layered history. It's a real problem when you have such a multi-layered history. Because you are committed to so many things coming from times immemorial that I would put it or phrase it by something that I heard from one of our students, American, in Tel Aviv University, who was an alumni of our international school. And when we had kind of a, let us say, gathering by which to close the year, and everybody got back home, we enabled everybody to come up with a lasting note. Lasting note. Just one sentence by which to say what you're going to take from here back home. And he, a Californian guy, who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and after that came to Tel Aviv University to be educated about the Middle East. He said something that I was amazed by. So sharp. How very observative of him to say something like, in this region, you are not allowed to move forward unless you got an approval from the past to do so. Since then, I was inspired by this sentence coming from my student. And I understood that the trick in the Middle East is something that is very, very misleading. Something that goes against the American famous idiom. I guess that you are familiar with the idiom of what you see is what you get. This is a very American philosophy of life. So I took that philosophy and paraphrased over that and said that in the Middle East, what you can't see is what you get. So start digging in. Think of what you can't see, not what you see on the ground. What you are being told by people who know everything about the Middle East. What you can't see. And what we can't see is the coming to the fore of dreams whims, wishes from times immemorial, and since we have 3 millennia history here, this is becoming very, very heavy and complicated. ISIS, by the way, which is being diminished this day, militarily speaking, of course, not necessarily conceptually speaking. ISIS actually was to capitalize on the breakup of state, capitalizing on the vacuum, the void that was left here after the American withdrawal, opening up a huge appetite to go for the other side of the border and create what they call Daesh, Dawla Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham, which is an Islamic state in Iraq and Syria, and the acronyms of that would be ISIS. Now, just in a nutshell, because we are not going to deal with ISIS, but see what ISIS has in mind when it became kind of an Islamic state. First of all, what ISIS says is that state in the Western sense of the word is not legal, should not be valid. There is only one state that should replace all these artificial creatures. And this is an Islamic state. In Arabic, Khilafah or Caliphate. This is a state without boundaries. Because what counts in the state, it is a people-centered. Your religious type would dictate your citizenship. In that sense, there is no Iraq. For ISIS, there is no Syria, no Lebanon, no Jordan, no Palestine, no whatever. Why? Because if you are going to be loyal to your nation state, you think secular. You are going to worship territory instead of worshiping God. This is a very typical anomaly taken from the multi-aged history or multi-years history of the Middle East. State versus religion. Have you thought about that? Who should be or who should we be loyal to? Try to think of that. Should I be loyal to my patrie, to my motherland, or I should be loyal to my religion? Because what ISIS is dictating is kind of a logic that says the more Syrian you are, the less Muslim you are. The more Jordanian you are, the less Muslim you are. The more French you are, the less Muslim you are. The more Belgian you are, the less Muslim you are. So what ISIS is doing is a nasty and vicious trick by which to take an element from the history of this region and drive a wedge at the very midst of the heart of people, forcing them to choose whether they are loyal to the state or to their religion. And you can understand, of course, what I'm saying here is based on research of 3 years on ISIS, let us say, media campaign, which is fascinating. You understand that ISIS is a phenomenon which is not to be understood as some radical Islam, Qaeda, or Muslim brothers of the 20th century. ISIS is a phenomenon of the 21st century. The head, the mind, is inspired by the 7th century. But the body is doing Facebook, Twitter, etc. So we have here an oxymoron, which is very, very difficult for a Western eye to grasp. And what ISIS is doing here is just to bring in the virus, to make people be polarized between their nationality and their religious identity. And unfortunately, it works. Now, ISIS is going to be diminished militarily speaking. But would that actually solve out the problem? I leave it to you to decide, but just kind of a hint. ISIS is not the problem. ISIS is a byproduct of the problem. ISIS is a symptom. So you can actually get rid of him, but then you have to ask yourself what I'm going to do with that. This is currently unresolvable, unsolvable, because nobody knows what to do with that. What the world is trying to sell you is kind of an equation that says that the more we are killing ISIS leaders and activists, the better the situation is. Nonsense. It's good to kill, actually, to get rid of ISIS. But if you don't have a political plan, which is corroborated and supported by the different players on the ground, you are going to find yourself in the same deadlock. Now remember that the problem of failed states, and there is also kind of a huge scholarly literature about that in Arabic. It's called the Dawla al-Fashila in some other language, because this is kind of a notion which is being used by most researchers with that regard. But just let us remind ourselves that the problems of the failed states are not to be confined to the state itself. Sooner or later, those problems are going to have a spillover effect over the neighboring nations or states or whatever. So we have now more than 2 million refugees in Turkey. And I dare say that Erdogan keep them as hostages, because if he is not going to get from Europe what he wants, he would just let them go to Europe. We have almost 2 million in Jordan, this tiny kingdom, which is being shaken by 1 million Iraqis, 1 million Syrians. Not to talk about Lebanon, where every 1 out of 4 is Syrian in origin. 25% of the population currently in Lebanon is basically Syrian. Boundaries, there is no meaning to that. Hezbollah was ordered by his patron Iran to cross the border and to help out Bashar. While doing that, Hezbollah exposed himself as a Shi'i satellite and lost his credibility in the Arab Sunni mainstream. So it won't surprise you if I would say that for Saudi Arabia, Hezbollah is a fierce rival, as Iran is. But at the same time, for Iran, ISIS is a fierce rival, and vice versa. And I can go on and on. What happened here is that there are no camps, bits and pieces, everybody for itself. So just try to imagine kind of a situation where every country, movement, state, society is trying to better its politics of survival. Nobody can forge a strategy. What you can come up with is just tactical alliances by which to better yourself. And humanitarian disaster. Precedent in the Middle East. Something unheard of. Almost 600,000 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by their own leaders. 600,000 Muslims, almost, were slaughtered by Muslims. 15 million refugees and displaced. Can you grasp it? 15 million people. Some of them are going to Europe in order to have a safe haven. But you know what's going on in Europe. It's not what we had in the 20th century. Europe is singing some other songs. Not everybody is more than welcome anymore. There are some racist slogans coming from Germany, France, not to mention Hungary, and some other Middle Eastern state, Middle East European state, sorry. Think of that. So what happened here? Are we moving forward? Or we are going back? I decided to title my forthcoming book with the title Back to the Future. Back to the future means that you cannot actually lean on the simplistic convention of the West, which says, bygone is bygone, passé is passé, let's move forward. In our region, you can't do that. If you don't have a way, very delicate, very sophisticated, to respect your past, respect religion, respect different cultures, creating kind of an eclectic ethos by which everybody can find himself, you are doomed. Because here what we got now is kind of a bloody war between Sunni and Shia, between Kurds and Turks, because somebody has undeliberately opened, and I'm quoting an American commander, which was to give the Pentagon a report of his stay in the United States. Somebody undeliberately has opened the Pandora's box of the Middle East. Now we have a totally different chessboard. What I am amazed is that while I'm going to Europe, United States, some other parts of the world, everybody is teaching the Middle East as if nothing happened. You can talk about the Arab Spring, okay. You can talk about what happened in Syria, but this would be just a piece of information. What should we do as researchers while dealing with this primordial identity? How are we going to ask ourselves how to build up a new and fresh agenda? Are we going to change our geopolitical maps and socio-demographic vocabulary? This is, of course, something which is becoming worldwide. I'm not an expert on the United States. But I am curiously, like I guess most of you in Mexico, following the presidential campaign in the United States. And it is very, very interesting to listen to Donald Trump. Not when he is trying to capitalize on what Hillary Clinton did with the emails or with the Clinton Fund, but when he speaks about Hispanics, blacks, white, what is that? Let me ask you, would you believe that in any former presidential campaign in the United States, a guy like Donald Trump speaking that way could make a candidate of the party for presidency? I think that the answer is clear, no. So what happened now? This is, again, something that is very applicable to what I said about the Middle East, albeit in a many different level. The artificial, unprofessional eye would try to understand Donald Trump as a phenomenon. The way he speaks, the way he moves. There is something charismatic or whatever that makes people follow him. But again, Donald is not the problem. Donald is the symptom of the problem. Something happens among the very ranks of American society. We don't know what it is. I personally, of course, didn't inquire into that. But it seems that this is the subject people who are dealing with it should look to. How come that America or the United States seems to have a different language among the different communities that which compiled the United States, and this is a very hatred and antagonistic discourse. There is zero tolerance. And I know definitely what my rights are, who I am. I'm not going to accept the demands of the other. Something happened here. With the era of globalization, we were told that we are going to have universalism. This was a very neoliberalist thinking, saying that people are people are people. It doesn't matter who you are. What counts is what you do. Now, my discipline speaks about the opposite. There is no universalism. Yeah, of course, we have the tricolor flag in France. We can speak about liberty, fraternity, equality. Where you can find it? Nowhere. Slogans. Culture matters. There is a disparity between people. Different cultures, different outlooks, different views. Now the question is whether we find the way or the mechanism by which to respect the otherness of the other. Not to turn it into kind of an endless war. We have to be aware of that, because professional troublemakers like ISIS could easily use the tools of globalization and poison the mind of many young Muslims, who, by the way, have nothing to do with religion. They have some other problems. So I can actually talk to you by Skype, website, Twitter, internet, whatever, and I'm not an expert on that, but I can tell you in my research center in Tel Aviv University, we have a bunch of what I call people of the 21st century, 20 years old, not more than that. I am, by the way, proud to say that I am a man or a guy of the 20th century. I know that I won't be never a 21st century guy. And I would not like and be able to have a speedy march by which to know better than you how to use the gadgets of the 21st century. I won't be able. But the simple fact that I know that, this is strength. I know what I can do. So because of that, what I organized actually in the Daya Center is a bunch of 20 PhD students fluent in Farsi, Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic. Others, experts on this whole media. And they are sitting day by day, coming up with precious information. Because day by day they talk to Arabs, Persians, Kurds, and Farsi, Iranian. This is a new world. Airplanes and tanks are not going to solve problems if this is the only thing you can come up with. Show me your cyber war people. Show me your expertise when it comes to virtual media. Show me the Muslims who are going to come up with a counter narrative to ISIS. And you know that. Nobody would solve all the problems but Muslims themselves. If you are waiting for Uncle Sam to come up with his suitcase and solve all the problems here, that won't happen. Not anymore. So for better, for worse, we have to wait and see whether Islam or Muslim societies can produce from within kind of a response to ISIS. Response in the sense of war of ideas. Because there must be counter-narrative that we would be much more appealing to those young Muslims or others who are pretty frustrated for any reason you can have in mind. Mentally ill, psychologically ill, very poor, have a totally different idea about the world. Problems of young people everywhere. And this is something that is very, very evident here, because what we happen to see here is the crush of nation states and people being confined to their primordial identities. I would say, and this metaphorically put, the Druze is much Druzier than before. The Kurd is much more Kurdish than before. Alawites, Turks, Persians, Sunnis, Shiites, Jews, Muslims, Christians, you name it. Now, this is a very dangerous situation. Because if we are letting that go on, we're going to have a horrible world. Because we're going to get demons coming from the past fighting each other. There is no time in that fight. It is eternal. People are not getting explanations by which to have a reasonable solution or understanding to things. So, for example, if I am Saddam Hussein, let's give you just one thing by which to understand what I'm saying. Sitting in April 2003 in Baghdad, listening to the voices of the units of the American army coming into Baghdad. And I coming up with a last try to make people of my sect or Iraqis to come against the Americans. You know what he said then? He said that Hulaku comes again. Hulaku comes again. What does that mean? Who knows who is Hulaku? I don't know if you know, but Hulaku for every young student, definitely in Iraq or in the Arab world, is the Mongolian dictator, harsh ruler, who in 1258 came from the east and demolished Baghdad. Collective memory. I don't have to explain to you what's going on now. Americans are modern hulakus. Period. And if you would like actually to come up with some more juicy indications to the story, well, the story goes like that. You know who provided hulaku with the key to the city of Baghdad, to the gates of the city? Shiites. So it is no surprise that the American Shiite concoction now is going to demolish Iraq. This is what Sunnis have in mind. They don't speak about Iraq. They first of all speak about the American Shiite conspiracy. So we don't live in a real world. If we are not going to have an elected ethos, if we are not going to let people respect the otherness of the other, the demons are going to dictate the rhythm. And we are going actually to listen to fair stories coming from the 7th century, the 10th century, and it is much, much stronger than any other reasonable argument. That's the problem. So what I try to do here, and this would be my concluding note, if I may, Carlos, this is okay? No? It's just to show you the tip of the iceberg. Nobody knows what we're going to end up with. Nobody knows. Except the Americans, I guess. Nobody knows. What we know, though, is there is no way back to status quo ante. So you see how difficult is this? While moving in a transitory period, when we know that everything is being changed, we have to be that responsive and creative as to come up with fresh agenda with some tools that would make it easier for us to conduct ourselves in a changing world. This, I think, is a message to Europe, maybe to the United States, not only the Middle East, because you have seen how easy the virus can be sent by the air. Not with battalions, not with planes, no tanks, no whatsoever. We have to just take it as a wake-up call. And I have to just conclude with a story that happened to me, and I know that Sarah actually had it yesterday, but let me just say it once again. And that would be my concluding note, I promise. I was invited to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa after this war that was waged by Hamas with Israel 2 years ago. It was called Protective Age. And I came up with kind of a very well articulated and planned presentation by which to explain what happened there. But the night before, I got kind of a phone call from, I think, the Secretary of the Parliament or somebody else, asking me if I would be so kind as to change my presentation's topic. Well, it was the 11th hour, and I had to ask myself, first, why? And second, what would you like to have instead? Why? is that, with all respect, Israel and Hamas is too small a subject to deal with these days. Second, we'd rather you talk about ISIS. And since I was amidst my book on ISIS, I provided this presentation, 1 hour presentation on ISIS, and the first question in the Q&A was, unsurprisingly, coming from an MP, asking me, wow, if that is the case, I wonder, what are you going to do about that? And I asked him, who is you? And he said, Israel, of course. So what he took from my presentation is that ISIS is a rival of Israel, which is not. I'm not saying that ISIS is a Zion lover, but ISIS is definitely fighting everybody else now. The notion that I'm far away and it has nothing to do with me was to knock on the door of the Octavian Parliament 3 weeks later on with a Canadian of Muslim origin slaughtering the bodyguards in the front of the Parliament and then being killed by others before he is getting to the Parliament, aiming at a carnage of MPs there. I'm not saying that this is the whole story, but it is very easy to be far away and to provide offers, suggestions, and thinking that, thanks God, this won't happen to me. In this world with globalization, with virtual media, we have to be closed and united together to come up with an educational revolution. This is something that politicians and statesmen won't do because they have to deal with the politics of survival. They don't have time for long-term programs. This is something that us, educators, academics, it doesn't matter what we think about this and that. We can disagree about a lot of things. But what we should promote is to let the later next generations have the chance, the ability to become grown-ups after having gone through an educational system that taught them to respect the otherness of the other. You can be different than me, no problem. And I would be different than you. We are not going to force the one on the other. But what we are going to do is to find, after respecting your otherness and my otherness, whether we can have a common denominator on which we can build up a field of cooperation. This is not easy. It has to do with culture and education. It has nothing to do with military and airplanes. And this is something by which also, through the prism of the failed states, to corroborate the notion that we have to think differently. We have to change our mode of thinking in order to really cope with the problems. Coming up with the conventions of the 20th century would be a disaster. So this is why I think we are in a wake-up call time, and this is why we academics and people who are dealing with the Middle East, with Europe, with societies, with memory, with identities, have to refresh our agenda, because what is needed now is a totally different mode of thinking. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Les pediría al público si están interesados en hacer alguna intervención. Tendríamos algunos minutos todavía disponibles. Natalia. ¿Sí? Sí, hay traductor.
Muchas gracias por su presentación, fue muy interesante. Yo quisiera preguntarle sobre las narrativas que usted mencionó, profesor. Por un lado, nos dice que para contrarrestar a ISIS es ineficiente, ineficaz la narrativa del nacionalismo secular que viene de Occidente, y seguramente tiene mucha razón por todo lo que expresó respecto a las identidades étnicas y las identidades religiosas como las identidades primarias que realmente importan. Por otro lado, usted expresó que es probablemente equivocado venir de otros lugares del mundo a dar recetas a un lugar que tiene una larga historia y que hay que conocer profundamente esa historia para que las recetas sean apropiadas. Mi pregunta entonces se refiere a si existen en las distintas comunidades intelectuales del propio Medio Oriente, en las universidades, en los lugares del pensamiento y de producción de ideas, semillas de esta contranarrativa que sí podría funcionar y que no venga de fuera y al mismo tiempo no sea el nacionalismo secularista del siglo XX que ha fracasado en esa región. Muchas gracias.
Ricardo, por favor.
Una sola pregunta. ¿Cómo los otomanos tenían, cuáles eran las bases del control otomano de esa región tan diversa hasta principios del siglo XX? A lo mejor ahí hay algunas claves que se podrían retomar. Gracias.
Silvia.
Buenas tardes. Primero que nada quisiera celebrar la apertura de este nuevo seminario en la universidad. A todas luces es de absoluta relevancia. Comprender la situación que se vive en el Medio Oriente es una asignatura que para todos en esta universidad tiene una importancia sobresaliente. La pregunta que yo quisiera hacer al doctor es, primero que nada, ¿por qué no tomó en consideración a lo largo de su exposición el desplazamiento de los cristianos de esta región? Creo que esto es uno de los grandes temas. Los números son también terribles y hay que comprender que en esta región del mundo, bueno, se dio el surgimiento de las tres grandes religiones monoteístas, lograron convivir durante mucho tiempo. Y bueno, esto al parecer se ha roto por completo. Entonces sí quisiera escuchar su opinión en torno al futuro de los cristianos en la región y cómo esto está impactando incluso la convivencia al interior de los campos de refugiados en Europa, donde los cristianos y los musulmanes tienen que convivir con historias también muy dramáticas. Gracias.
Andrés.
¿Quién va primero?
Sara.
Gracias. Doctor Rabi, ¿dónde queda la Israel en este caso? Porque la narrativa de Israel sí es la de un Estado-nación moderna, o lo entiendo mal yo, entonces eso quisiera que me lo explique, por favor.
Andrés, ya habla. Sí.
Profesor, muchas gracias. Quisiera saber, dentro de este relato que nos dio del fracaso de la idea de nación a la europea y del regreso de identidades más antiguas, ¿cómo se integra esta nueva propuesta que están proponiendo el Partido de los Trabajadores de Kurdistán o el movimiento Royadá, que ahora pretende ser ya no una propuesta nacional, sino transnacional.
Bueno, yo quisiera entender, a partir de lo que nos comenta el doctor, sobre la mentalidad con la que se está abordando el problema de ISIS, ¿por qué se han ensañado, o sea, a partir de esta idea de que son volver al siglo VII, como lo comentó? ¿En qué medida o por qué cómo se inserta el que ahora estos ejércitos están destruyendo los restos de las culturas antiguas en toda esa zona? Todo lo que tiene que ver con los antiguos imperios. ¿Que no debería ser desde ahí la semilla de la que usted nos habla?
¿Alguien más?
Bueno, un poco respecto a la forma en que concluyó su conferencia, en que abogaba por un discurso que favoreciera la tolerancia ante la otredad y ante esta otredad radical y aceptada. ¿Cómo podría eso plantearse ante discursos como tanto los de Maududi o Qutb en el lado islámico, o Frauke, Petri y Le Pen en el lado occidental, digamos, que ven la tolerancia como un mal radical y como justo la parte del problema y como una especie de discurso liberal desarraigador que ha acabado con los pueblos en sí mismos? O sea, ¿cómo podría contrarrestarse eso?
Gilberto.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, me parece que fue muy interesante, sobre todo la idea esta al final de que la narrativa frente a Daesh debe venir de los musulmanes mismos, particularmente de los jóvenes. Sin embargo, la situación en la que se encuentran hoy los jóvenes musulmanes, particularmente en Siria e Irak, es una situación muy compleja, muy difícil. No serviría, no ayudaría a poner un ejemplo de aceptación de la otredad, el empezar a concretar la paz en el Medio Oriente, particularmente en Israel-Palestina?
Bueno, vamos a tomar una más porque si no, no va a poder responder. Bueno, por favor.
Gracias. ¿Cómo poder afirmar que el modelo, digamos, de Estado-Nación está fracasando si las identidades, como usted mismo lo dijo en la conferencia, no son las de antes, ahora son identidades mucho más fuertes? Es cierto, hay una crisis de convivencia, digamos, del día a día, digamos, pero las identidades son muy fuertes. Eso es un producto de esta concepción occidental. Podemos esperar a futuro, digamos, bueno, esa es una parte, ¿no? El cómo resolver esa contradicción, cómo decir, está fracasando el modelo Estado-Nación, pero a la vez las identidades se fortalecen. Entonces, y la otra es, podemos esperar a futuro una balcanización, digamos, una suerte de lo que está pasando en los Balcanes, o lo que pasó en los Balcanes, digamos, conciliar de cierta manera estas nuevas concepciones ajenas a Medio Oriente, occidentales, pero con una, digamos, atención hacia el pasado. Gracias.
Vamos a pedirle que responda y si hay tiempo continuamos. Please.
Okay, so I don't know where to start with, but I'll try to go almost one by one, but I have to tell you there are many questions that do relate to either the solution of that problem or how to actually deal with that. I mean, I'll start with you because you were the first. Listen, I'm not saying what should be done because I don't know how to solve it out.
But I have to make sure that if you have kind of an ambition to solve it out, start with reading the map by its sectarianism. So, if this, let us say ISIS state, and ISIS is going to be evaporated, but it is Sunnis. So don't even think of bringing Shiites or Kurds to the Sunni areas. So if you have to think of something, think of a federation sort solution. Federation-like, solution. Which again is based on, even if not accepting the otherness of the other, is based on live and let live. This is, by the way, second question. What was here before? 600 years without almost any bloody war here. What, the Ottomans were genius? How did they run the show? Now, Ottomans were discredited in the 20th century because every nationalist movement, Ataturkism, Arabism, Zionism, were to be built up on the ruins of Ottomanism. So smashing Ottomanism was a very nationalistic thing. But ask yourself, 600 years? 600 years ruling over half of the globe? The Ottomans were very clever. Live and let live. Shiites, Shiites. Kurds, Kurds. As long as they accept us as rulers from above, that's okay. You know, and when the French came in 1798 with Napoleon Bonaparte, when they came to Egypt, you know what was the mission? Mission civilisatrice. We're going to educate them. We're going to let them change. They have to be progressed like us. You see how patronizing this thing is? How arrogant this thing is? You know, when Barack Obama was nominated president in the United States, he sent a telegram to Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. And in the leader, there were greetings on the eve of Nowruz, the new year in Iran. And what Obama said, because Obama thought of how to appease Iran from the beginning, he said, "Dear Supreme Leader, I do respect you and your nation. I beg you to think of us as partners. And please have in mind that the United States had ever or always kept to its promises and came with kind of a fresh, creative diplomacy that was to solve problems between nations and between civilizations. Ever since. And you know what was the response? Thank you for that. You have to show us that you are going to change your policy. We cannot count on words. We would like to see deeds. First of all, show us how you treat the Zionists differently than your predecessors. So we can know that there is something change here. But, and that was the foci of the letter, Are you talking about yourself as ever since? Who do you talk to? Have you remembered that we are 3 millennia here? That we invented human civilization? So this is something that you must take into account before getting into the fold. If you think like an American or a Westerner, you are going to harm undeliberately the one who stands on the other side of the table. So what I am is, you can call me sort of a, I don't know, cultural translator, okay? If you don't have an understanding full about cultures, you can do nothing, just nothing. And this is why I say that the Ottomans had something else in mind, and it seems actually to have been working successfully. Live and let live. I'm not going to get into your life. I'm not going to force you to change your traditions and practices. What I want you is just to pay taxes and acknowledge me as the supreme leader. With the French in Egypt, no. Mission civilisatrice. We are going to make you sort of French. Even if you are Egyptians, Muslims, that doesn't matter. You're going to speak like us. You're going to think like us. You're going to look like us. You're going to be us. Christians, there are many publications in the scholarly literature about the diminishing role and presence of Christians in the Middle East. If this is what we're going to get in the coming years, I dare say that Christians are not going to be left in the Middle East. Just like that. You know, when Morsi came to Egypt, many Copts, Christians in Egypt, left Egypt. Thereafter, Sisi brought them back because Sisi is speaking about Egyptianism. Egyptianism that is tolerating different cultures and religions. When Morsi and the Muslim brothers were here, it was loud and clear. We are the superior, you are the inferior. And you know, if you can think of that, you know, under ISIS, by the way, there are colonies of Christians who are paying the jizya, which is a tax, which has to be paid by the inferior. And that is acceptable. So ISIS gave them actually two options. Three, sorry. You can die, we can kill you. You can Islamize yourselves. Or you can keep your Christianity, but you are going to understand and to act as second-class citizens. This is exactly what happened in the caliphate. ISIS is not inviting nothing, but just read the holy scripts in kind of a very puritanic way. That's the problem with them. And you know, when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to Quran, when it comes to that stuff, it depends not what is written, how you read it, which interpretation you are coming up with. And this is why we have to do that. You ask me a lot of questions about contradictions, things that are, I don't know, the narrative of, let us say, nationalism goes against this primordial identities. No, that's not what I said. You have a really tough job to build up a national ethos that would respect the differences of different cultures. So you have to come up with a mix. It's not an either-or game. It's not that if you are not going to be loyal to the state, you are not going to be here or whatever. We are going to build up an elastic state that would leave much room for you to do your practices and tradition, and that won't contradict your national obligations. I'm trying to build up sort of a formula, but this is exactly what should be. It won't be 100% successful. I guess there would be a lot of problems, because always there would be somebody who would think that he is deprived of something or discriminated against. But you're going to have kind of a dialogue that is being built up on the simple understanding that he is not like me, but still we could have coexistence, which is being built up on common denominator. You know, I mean, I am going to lead a delegation to a place in Spain called Andalusia. In Andalus, in the 12th and the 13th century, we are going there because we would try to understand what worked there. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together, and this was the most flourishing era of writings by all the three, actually, monotheist religions, side by side, by having sort of a discourse of discussion, arguing against, but creating kind of an ethos that was to make people much more creative, much more happy, I guess. You know, this is the period where Muslims actually could talk about Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi and others. Jews would talk about Rambam and some other, let us say, big shots. And the Christians actually could do the same thing until actually this whole Inquisition and Reconquista and all that stuff began there. And, you know, because this is part of your history. So history is very tricky. Something happens there and would cause a totally different result in other part of the world. So I'm not going to divide things. I'm trying actually to educate you to think in kind of a holistic perception and to take everything into account. It is very tough, very difficult, but make sure that your mind is not going to be trained and programmed in line with a yes or no, black or white dichotomies. This is actually what we can't do. Look at your personal life. No, not you, let me. Have I achieved what I would like to? Not necessarily. Or every one of us didn't get what he really think he should get from the beginning? Our personal lives are full of compromises. So how come that we would like our communal life to be very clear-cut and strict? Either or is a very dangerous prism for a researcher. Either or is something which is very, very good for the one who doesn't know that he doesn't know. For the one who thinks that he knows everything. It's just this or that. Two options. You start know that you don't know. And this is kind of a knowledge. So make the most of it. There was a question about the Kurds. And I actually didn't get it to the end. Let me start actually responding and tell me if that is the right direction. Because I can't remember your question and I don't think that I write it right. You know, even when it comes to the Kurds, take for example this question. Kurds. So who are the Kurds? Are we talking about the Kurds of Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey? You know that each one of them is writing and reading differently, even if that is Kurdish, but it is written in Latin letters, when it comes to Turkey, and Arabic letters when it comes to Syria and Iraq. So there are many, many talks among Kurds about whether to have the revival of Kurdistan. If you ask me, that won't happen. Too difficult. But it It's not to say that there is no kind of relationship between the Kurds of Iraq and others. So the Kurds know one thing. They are people. They are not going to let it go. It's a golden opportunity for them. They are the winners of the Arab Spring, if you ask me. And they're going to end up one way or the other with sort of a nation state or an autonomy or whatever. And Kurds, by the way, are part of the solution because they are bold, courageous, and they fight ISIS. And Peshmerga is coming up with kind of a very good performance when it comes to ISIS in Mosul. They have a lot of problems with the PKK, YPD, actually other branches in Syria. So this is a very convoluted process. Barzani, Talabani, everybody actually has its own idea on how to better the Kurds. There are a lot of disagreements there. But the Kurds are people, and this is kind of a common consensus, and that we can take for the time being. Israel. Well, you know, again, I'm here and there, I still listen to people, and that is very dangerous, because if somebody is teaching his class, and it is not that I'm an Israeli when I'm saying that, after all what we said, and I know that it is being done here and there still, following the conventional truth of the 20th century, where everybody said, you know what the problem of the Middle East? Israel and the Palestinians. Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or Israel alone. So here you get another slogan that many people still stick to that, ignoring the humanitarian disaster we have here. So misleading people without even taking the responsibility of making it a little bit more balanced. Israel should be criticized. Okay, I am criticizing Israel too. Israel is not kind of a pure state. But you know what? Israel is a tiny state, 8 million people, and this is the only state for Jews. I'm not familiar with any other Jewish state in the world. Now we have a problem with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have a problem with us, and we should sit together, and only us could solve out the problem, Palestinians and Israelis. I'll tell you why. Because the whole world has not really a keen interest in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They would say that, but that's lip service. This is not the key for solving out the problems of the Middle East. This is a conflict that should be solved out, yes. And it is better for Israelis and Palestinians to have sort of a partition for two states. I agree. So we need here to tango. But we don't even have one dancer, not two. So how are we going to solve it out? If you would like me to tell you what the average Israeli would say and what the average Palestinian would say, I would tell you. Most of them would like to have an agreement. Most of them do not believe that would be an agreement. Think of that. I think it should be, but I know that it is not to be achieved. Why? Just like that. Mistrust, distrust. We don't have a leadership that would take us into the right path, and so on and so forth. So I beg you to understand. Listen, it's just a recommendation. If you are going to build up classes on the Middle East, focusing on the Arab-Israeli conflict, you are going to mislead people. And they are going to live and die with the false truth that this is the foci of the Middle East. It is just not like that. And if you would like actually to taste the flavor of that, you should go and visit a refugee camp in Jordan, as I did, in some other states, see the misery, and then start thinking again on what should be done in the Middle East. If you would like to criticize Israel, that's okay. Again, but to take Israel as the A and Z is as if actually to mislead people and bring them into kind of a position where their thinking is twisted. They cannot even analyze things. So at least open up the discussion. Don't come up with kind of axiom, it is axiom because nobody can argue against that. Axiom would tell you where to look. You are not going to have a real and deep understanding and insight of what's going on. So, the mental thing of ISIS, somebody asked about demolishing the ancient sites. Well, this is exactly what I talked about. Pyramids, Babylon, sin. This is something that is not to be recognized. This is exactly something that ISIS takes as ancient westernization. Or the West are the modernized, let I say, sinners of the past. What happened before Islam. So I know that this is very important, but I think that we should say that. I didn't talk about young people necessarily coming up with an anti-discourse against ISIS. I'm talking about community leaders, clerics, academics, intelligentsia. People who would be that courageous to say, ISIS is evil. And I'm willing not only to say that, but to fight that. If that won't happen, I'll tell you what happened. Many Europeans would look at Muslims and would say, how come that all Muslims are silent? Maybe deep inside, they accept ISIS, which is not true. But this is the impression which is being left behind. And then, let's move to the other thing. Who is going to capitalize on that? Marie Le Pen. Marie Le Pen is saying exactly that. And what we got is Islamophobia on the one hand, and right-wingers with it, and Muslim enclaves who are going to be confined by themselves as subcultures. Who is going to fall into the cracks? The neoliberalist, François Hollande, who is thinking a lot how to speak and what to say in order not to cross the red line of political correctness. This is why I am so anxious about that. Because it is time to name the problem. It is time to do other things. And I'm pretty sure that something should be done and could be done. I'm not expecting a Marshall Plan coming from the whole world, as was the case in the Second World War. But I can tell you, if we are not going to get something like that, we are in real trouble. If everybody cynically think of his narrow interest, we are in a real trouble. And this is a different world. Again, everybody by itself. There are no blocks. I don't know if I left something, I don't remember, but listen. What I'm trying to say is, and I'm going back to the first question, and the lady is just left. It is not that I'm saying actually what to do. I'm just offering how to think. This is what I'm trying to say. Don't stick to the notions of the 20th century. It is misleading. So if we can read the map that was here before, we should go with the sectarian lines because those identities are pretty resilient. And now you have a problem. How are you going to compromise between the past and the present in order to build up a very balanced future? If we are going to have an eternal and endless fight here, because I can't survive and prevail unless you are diminished, as ISIS say, as Hamas says, oh, that is a problem for the human civilization. Because these people don't need kind of a state or kind of a military fort. They just browsing the internet and campaigning for a totally twisted thinking. And what is very, very sad is that there are always people who would buy that. And this is why we talk about the lone wolf. I just, this morning actually heard about the CNN when a young lady which was actually running the show there asked what we gonna do with those lone wolves. A guy come at a certain morning, takes a knife and stab his neighbor. And he is shouting, Allahu Akbar. This is what Allah told you? This is what God told you? No. We know that somebody has manipulated on this guy's predicament. So this is why I say, if this guy won't have a chance to get a counter narrative, we're going to have more and more of that. And this is epidemic. Epidemic. You know, failed states are not to be confined, as we say, to their territory. It is going everywhere. Viruses. People are going to be infected by that. Like Zika, Tika, and I don't know. But this is kind of a psychological virus, which is much more dangerous. Because it makes people do things that they even didn't think they're going to do. I think that I tried actually to cover, I don't know if I must apologize for he or she that I didn't really address her or his exact question, but okay, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. So it's the same is like that. Many people wants to answer, but
yeah.